Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Joshua Prager. Joshua was a senior writer for the Wall Street Journal. He's an author who likes to write about historical secrets. He has written 3 books, and today we will talk about his latest book, The Family Roe, an American story. Joshua, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
So, Joshua, you bring humanity to one of the most contagious legal cases in the United States. And I have so many questions about your book. But before we get to that, I would like to ask you a little bit about your book background. I see that you have written for the Wall Street Journal and you have become an author. Is this what you always wanted to do, to be a journalist and an author?
That's a good question. I actually had decided just at the end of high school when I was 18 or 19 years old that I was going to be a doctor, like my father. But then what happened was when I was 19 years old, I was in a very bad bus accident and my neck was broken and I had a spinal cord injury. And I used a cane. I was in a wheelchair for 4 years. Since then, I use a cane. It's been 31 years and I'm okay. But that accident changed my career path because at the time I was very disabled and it seemed to me that it would be very hard to be a doctor. And what happened was when I then went to college, I wrote an article in the school newspaper about the fact that even though a law had passed, the Americans with Disabilities Act, this was in 1990, saying that my school had to be accessible for me in my wheelchair, the school was never making it accessible. Every time I needed to get to a class, an elevator was broken or a ramp wasn't down. And I was very frustrated. So finally, I wrote an article in the newspaper, the school newspaper, and they changed it. They made everything accessible after that because they didn't want to get sued. And I was young, I was 19 years old, and this article changed my life and it made me feel good. And I said, I've always enjoyed writing. Maybe I will become a journalist. And that is what I did.
This is so amazing. I have heard this story so many times of how an article, something written down, can change the future of a whole community. And in this case, where you wrote about your disability, and the university went along to do these changes. And I think this is something that continues coming back. These disabled people are having a hard time going into a restaurant, just getting
That's right.
yeah, so that's just incredible. um how is it that you ended up writing for the Wall Street Journal? That's, by the way, one of my favorite newspapers.
Well, what happened was I wasn't sure after college what kind of journalism I would like to do. I interned at a radio station, at a television station, and at a magazine over those next few years in college and right afterwards. And I most enjoyed working at the magazine. It was in Israel called the Jerusalem Report. And even though I was just starting answering phones and only writing a little bit, I enjoyed that the most. And when I came back here to America, I sent out an application everywhere and I just got rejected from everyone, including a job I got rejected for was answering the phones at the Wall Street Journal as a news assistant. But I reapplied and I got accepted there. And I worked my way up pretty quickly. I got there in 1995. I became a reporter in 1998. I started writing for the front page the next year. And in 2000, I wrote an article that really changed my career again. It was about a children's book, Goodnight Moon. And it had to do with just what you mentioned in the introduction, a secret connected to an historical thing. It was about this very famous book, but nobody knew that the author of it, a woman named Margaret Wise Brown, had bequeathed the royalties to the books to a little boy who lived next door. No one knew why she did this. And then when she died suddenly, he inherited those royalties. And the article tells the story. His own family hadn't spoken to him in 30 years. And I found him and told his story. That article is on my website. It's just my name, joshuaprager.com, Prager. Anyway, I became interested in these things, secrets connected to historical things. And I wrote another one the next year about a very famous baseball game, the most famous baseball game in American history and our national pastime. And I wrote again about a big secret. The fact that a famous team, the 1951 Giants, were cheating. No one knew that. And they told me their stories for the first time. And it was fascinating to me. And so I came to be interested in this. And that was really what led, in a sense, also to this book on Roe v. Wade.
Okay, so how come this book, Roe v. Wade, came into atmosphere?
Well, what happened was I was in France in 2010, and I was finally, after all those years, 20 years after the bus accident I was in that made me disabled, I was going to write a little book about disability. I was at a friend's house for a year. And while I was there, I read an article in the New Yorker magazine saying that it mentioned, it was an article about gay marriage, actually, and it mentioned the plaintiffs from other famous cases, including Jane Roe, a woman named Norma McCorvey. And it mentioned that she had never had the abortion she sought because the case took too long to be decided for her to have the abortion. And so she'd given birth to the child and placed it for adoption. And it seemed to me, wow, that means somewhere there is a child I came to read online that the pro-life community looks at, it refers to as the Roe baby. And that
Mm.
person had never been found. And it was interesting to me that this human being's conception had led to the filing of Roe v. Wade. And I had this hunch that he or she probably knew that they had been born to Norma McCorvey, to Jane Roe, and that that would be a very difficult thing to carry. And it took me a year, but I found Norma's private papers, Jane Roe's private papers, in a garage in Texas, in the home where she previously lived. And that led me, those papers led me to find the Roe baby, who eventually decided to speak with me. And that was the beginning of this book. My interest grew from that one person to her sisters, the other children Norma McCorvey had given birth to and placed for adoption, and then to Norma herself, and then to Roe v. Wade, and then to the whole of abortion in America. So the book started with that one idea, but became a much bigger thing.
Well, I find that in the United States, these are the most contagious issues. The legalization of drugs that is becoming less and less relevant. More states are legalizing drugs. Gay marriage, which is also becoming less relevant, less and less people argue about it. Gun control, immigration, and abortion seems to take every year a bigger and bigger role in American society, and the divide becomes even deeper. And it's just I have a hard time getting over it, especially that other countries are getting over that issue. I live in
Yeah.
Canada. Abortion here is not a big issue. Mexico just legalized abortion, and although it's still kind of like a taboo, the society is adopting quite well. But in the United States, the issue continues. It's like a revolving door. It continues coming back over and over again.
You're
I want.
exactly right.
I wonder if
I'll
you.
just, yeah, I'll just comment on that. What you're saying is 100% true. It is the single most contentious issue in America today, even more than race. It divides our country. It's like a civil war. Roe was filed in 1970, so 51 years ago. And I write in the book through the lives of human beings, not through law or politics, but I explain why that has happened, how that has happened. And it is something that is becoming even more polarizing. And of course, now our Supreme Court, starting in just a few weeks, is about to hear a case out of Mississippi that is going to address Roe v. Wade, and they could finally overturn Roe. And in the book, I write about why is it in America particularly that this has divided our country where it doesn't in other countries. And Norma's life, Jane Roe's life, is perfectly suited for me to tell that larger story because, and I also tell it to other people, but she's front and center because I explore her family. And she was the third successive generation in her family to have an unwanted pregnancy. And all three of those women, their lives are rerouted. They're never the same. And my book shows why that is. And their family was very religious, first Catholic, then Pentecostal, then Jehovah's Witnesses, and then Norma becomes evangelical. And I show what happens when there is sort of a seeming irreconcilability between sex and religion, when it seems that because of religion, an unwanted pregnancy will destroy your life. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. And my book shows what happens when it is that way. It really, in effect, leads to where we are now. It is an enormous mess. And the reader in my book comes to understand that by reading Norma's story.
You start the book by telling the story of the Arcadians, and that's that's quite familiar because I live in Quebec, which is
Oh, wow.
the place where the great migration of Acadians went to the United States. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about this migration and how is it. I mean, you went through several generations of families from the 1700s onto finally Norma's life. But can you tell us and the influence of the church and their decisions on having babies? Yeah, can you just go back to that story for a few minutes?
Absolutely. So you're right. I mentioned just previously that I, excuse me, that I tell the story of Norma and Norma's mother and Norma's grandmother. Well, I trace it back even further to show where they came from. And you're right. They all came from, their ancestor came from to America from Acadia. Now, Acadia was a French colony in northeastern North America. So basically, you're talking about Nova Scotia and areas like that, and from Canada. And they came to this country because they were driven from their homes. That started in 1755, and starting in 1764, just 9 years later, those people began to settle along a river in Louisiana, 2,000 miles to the southwest. That river was called the Atchafalaya River. And it was along that river that Norma was born. And these people, they were very poor. They were looked at as ignorant. They were uneducated. And the word Cajun is actually a variant of Acadian. So I tell this story. I wanted people to understand where this community, where I wanted to understand where Norma's family came from, and they were part of that. They were part of that immigration. Their first person in the family who came here was a man. Let me see what his name. Oh yeah, it was Amon Gautreaux, and he came in the 1760s. And so I trace back. It's like 6 or 7 generations until you then lead up to Norma's grandmother, who is the one who is suddenly at 17 years old. She's not married and she's pregnant, and this changes her life.
Wow. Okay. And Norma's life, her life was um, interesting to say the least. She was a lesbian or attracted to people of the same sex. She was a sex worker. She was a feminist. She went in and out of religion. She had daughters. Can you tell us a little bit about, I don't know, her early childhood to the moment that she had
Yeah.
this case?
So what happens is Norma, I mentioned her mother. So her mother, Mary, gets pregnant when she's 17 years old. She's not married. The family is very upset, and they make her leave their town along that Louisiana River. She has to be disappeared so that it's not embarrassing to them. And when she gives birth in the town of the city of Baton Rouge, they then bring her back with the baby, but they take the baby from her, and they raise the baby themselves, and they don't let her have the baby. Well, this destroys her. She becomes an alcoholic. She and a waitress serving alcohol. She sleeps with many of the men she's serving in those bars. And this is Norma's mother. And Norma is then raised in a broken home with a lot of extramarital affairs and a lot of alcohol. And when Norma becomes an adolescent, let's say 12, 13 years old, she's in and out of trouble. She's sent away to schools for quote unquote delinquent children. And when she then comes out to her mother as a lesbian, her mother beats her. I interviewed her mother. She was not ashamed of the fact that she beat Norma about this. And Norma then gets married at 16 years old to a man. She's soon divorced. She has a child. She doesn't want that child, and she gives that child to her own mother, to Mary, just as her mother had had to give up her child to her mother. But she doesn't want the child. And Norma lies later, tells everyone that the child was kidnapped, when in fact she was begging her mother to adopt the child from her. And Norma then, even though she's gay and works in gay bars and has hundreds of affairs with women, she also sleeps occasionally with men. And she gets pregnant 2 more times. And the second time she gives up, her second child, she also relinquishes to adoption. And when she's pregnant for the third time, that's in 1969, that's when she wants to have an abortion. And that leads her to becoming Jane Roe.
And of course, she had a hard time getting an abortion because it was illegal in Texas, although it was legal in many other states. And although she was able to find a clinic, she couldn't afford it.
That's right. That's exactly right. She lied about that too. She later told people that she went to the clinic and it was caked in blood and it was dramatic and dangerous. The truth was much simpler. She found an abortion clinic that was safe, but was too expensive for her. It was $500. She had no money. She's had sort of all sorts of sad dead end jobs, including, as you mentioned earlier, being a prostitute. She sold drugs. She wanted to have an abortion and she couldn't afford it. Abortion was legal in a few other states, including in California, but she couldn't afford to get to California. And so she tells this to her adoption lawyer, a man named Henry McCluskey. And he happened to have gone to law school with a woman named Linda Coffey. And Linda Coffey had helped him file a suit just before that had to do with the sodomy laws in Texas, the laws that made gay sex illegal. And she was very brilliant. And she had mentioned to him that she was hoping to file a suit against the abortion statutes in Texas. But that she couldn't find a plaintiff. And he said, oh my God, I think I have a plaintiff for her. So he contacted Linda, and Linda did indeed represent Norma and file Roe on her behalf. A second lawyer joined the case, a woman named Sarah Weddington. And they probably could have at least tried to help Norma to have an abortion. Sarah Weddington, for example, worked at an abortion referral clinic, abortion referral service in Texas. But it was more important to them to have a plaintiff. They wanted her to be pregnant, not pregnant. And they did not tell her about the ways they might be able to help her. It would have been hard. She was approaching the end of her second trimester, but they didn't even try. And so she then carried her child, gave the child up for adoption. That was the child who became the Roe baby. That led me into my story.
Wow. And I see that history continues repeating itself, because nowadays, if you're a woman who in Texas who wants to have an abortion, you have to go out of the state to have that abortion, and many women cannot afford that. They had to go to, what is it, Alabama or any other states, even to Mexico now, which abortions are legal in Mexico. But due to the political climate, especially in Texas, it's Roe versus Wade all over again.
Absolutely. It's amazing to me. My book took me 11 years and it came out at this crazy, timely place. And my book is based in Texas, just like what's going on right now. You're right. SB 8, Senate Bill 8 says that abortion illegal anytime after 6 weeks. I mean, this is obviously, many women don't even know they're pregnant yet. So history does repeat itself. And what remains the same is, of course, it's the poor who are screwed. These are the people who have to suffer and struggle to get an abortion, because if you have money, you can travel to where it is legal. And it is a depressing story.
Can you talk about how the two different camps, the pro-life and the what is it, the
Choice.
how are they using this, how they use Norma during all this debate, and how Norma herself flip-flopped from one camp to the other?
Absolutely. Norma was exploited by both sides, but there was a difference. The pro-choice side, they did not want to have anything to do with Norma. They wanted to use her for her case and then let her go. She didn't speak in the ways that they liked. They didn't represent the cause in ways that they liked. The pro-life, of course, wanted to hold her close and say, hey, she was rejected by the other side, and look, she's with us. But they also used her enormously. What they would do is, they would tell her to say the things that they wanted her to say. But you know what Norma really believed? She believed that abortion ought to be legal through the first trimester of pregnancy. But that did not make the leaders on the pro-choice side happy, who believe it needs to be legal through the second trimester. And it certainly didn't make the leaders on the pro-life side happy, who believe increasingly that abortion ought to be illegal from the moment of conception. The reason Norma flip-flopped in the first place was, even though, yes, her interest in religion was genuine and she became a born-again Christian, what infuriated her was that she was marginalized by the pro-choice. And particularly what infuriated her was that Sarah Weddington, one of her two lawyers, did not tell her that she herself had had an abortion in Mexico, and that she worked at this abortion referral network. And Norma found this out in 1992 when Sarah Weddington wrote a book, and she became so angry that when then a man named Flip Benham, who was an evangelical minister, approached her a few years later in 1994, Norma was really ready to flip to the other side, and she did. But unfortunately, that did not bring her peace either. Now, it's true that Norma exploited people back just as they exploited her. She made sure to wring a living out of this. It was a way for her to eke out a living, to make money as the years passed. But she was not happy. She was tormented. She wasn't treated well. And in the end, she really was alienated from both sides of the issue. And it's sad. She gave her body to one side and her soul to the other side, and yet they didn't really help her. It's a sad story.
Wow, it is sad indeed. How about Norma Scow? You had the fortune to be able to interview her. What was her opinion or her standing during all this process?
So I found all three of the children Norma had given birth to, three girls she gave birth to by three different men. And all of them, they don't use the language of the pro-choice, but all three of them believe that abortion ought to be legal, at least to a certain point in pregnancy. It makes them uncomfortable that a woman might use abortion, as they said, as a form of birth control, or that she might have too many abortions, or that she might have an abortion too late in pregnancy. But they all believe that abortion needed to be legal. I found all three of them, and I brought them together. They were looking for each other. And when they came together, it was very moving. But of course, it's one thing to be related to each other biologically. It's another thing to be a family. And these relationships were complicated for them. And one of the three, the eldest, is not really close with the other two. She wishes that she was, but they have a difficult time. And I just tried to tell their stories with empathy and understanding, just like I tried to tell the stories of both sides of this issue with empathy and understanding. My book is very fair. You really don't know where I stand in my book, even though I mentioned at the end in the author's note that I am pro-choice. I didn't want to lie to people, but I didn't write this book as an activist. I wrote this book as a journalist, and I simply present the issues honestly as best I can.
Okay, I'm still digesting all the information that you have given me. I wonder if you could put on your future-looking glasses and tell us where this is going to end up. What is it going to be the landscape in the United States, I don't know, 20, 30, 50 years from now in regards to abortion or the anti-abortion movement?
It's a good question. What I think will happen is this. The Supreme Court right now is very conservative. It obviously has 6 conservative justices. And even if you take away Justice Roberts, who is the Chief Justice, of course, and who is uncomfortable being seen as an activist judge, he cares more about precedent and he cares about the reputation of the court. It's still 5-4 conservative majority because of President Trump's 3 appointees. And they didn't take this case, the Dobbs case, for no reason. They took it because it's a perfect vehicle to overturn Roe. Now, they probably won't overturn it outright, although it's possible. What they will probably do is to get rid of the viability threshold, the idea that abortion is legal until viability, until that is roughly 24 weeks, the point at which the fetus can survive outside the womb. And what that means is that basically abortion can be rendered illegal in states that want to, because that means that all pre-viability bans are now going to be constitutional. Um, if you then look ahead, you're going to end up, even if they don't overturn it outright now or even in another year or two, you're going to end up where abortion is functionally illegal in roughly half of the country. The fighting will continue, the horrible polarization will continue, all of this will continue. But eventually, if states are left to decide for themselves, maybe the fighting will die down. And you will then have a situation where if you are a woman in a poor state, if you are a poor woman in a state where abortion is illegal or functionally illegal, you will then travel. There will be organizations that help those women to travel to the neighboring states where it is legal. Now, this will still have effects that will probably curtail abortion enormously among the very poor, but that is what we're looking at. You're going to look at a divided country where there are states where abortion is possible and states where it isn't.
Wow, I try to also because I live in a different country. I live in Canada. I wonder if the United States will, at a given moment in history, will become in love with the rest of the industrialized world. And just to give you an example, the United States was one of the last industrialized countries to abolish slavery, and I wonder if it will be one of the last industrialized countries to come into the pro-choice camp.
Hmm. Well, I what I think, as I say, it's going to be a divided country.
Right.
One of the things I looked at is why America? Why? And part of the answer is what I talked about, the irreconcilability of sex and religion. America has these sort of puritanical roots, and I think sex and religion is a big part of it, but also politics, of course.
Right.
And even before Roe, and I go into this in the book, there was the beginning of, there were those who began to politicize abortion. But certainly after Roe, it became what it is today. And little by little, the camps switched. Reagan became pro-life. He had been pro-choice. Bush became pro-life. He had been pro-choice. On the other side, Al Gore and Jesse Jackson and others, they were pro-life. They became pro-choice. Now you have to sort of, if you're a Republican, oppose abortion. If you're a Democrat, support it. So it's sort of a sad state of affairs.
Well, Joshua, once again, I think you bring this issue to a human perspective. So you separated the politics and the religions and just bring it to life to how each individual can experience abortion or anti-abortion movements on their own life. I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow you?
Sure. Thank you. The title of the book is The Family Roe, An American Story. And they can see more about it at my website, which is www.joshuaprager.com, prager.com, or they can get the book anywhere, Amazon, independent bookstores, Barnes and Noble. But thank you very much. I appreciate it.
It's me who thank you, Joshua. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.